shoveling fuel for a runaway train. Errant economists, shameful spenders, and a plan to stop them all. By Brian Czech. We don't have a back paper today, so we'll just get our candles lit. One, two, and the one you can't see is three. This book, I'm currently doing a master's by research in conservation funding. So the author of this, Brian Czech, he and Paul Krausman wrote basically the definitive book on the Endangered Species Act. And so that's where I became aware of Brian Czech and his work. And I don't actually remember then how I came across this book, but the concepts I thought would be quite interesting. And it is a quite interesting book. So we'll look at, there are two parts to the book. So you have part one, the Runaway Train. And this part I really enjoyed. I thought this was very good, excellent quality. Except perhaps chapter 4, but I'll get into that in a moment. And then part two is stopping the train. So this is building the case for basically what the problems are with our current economic system. And then the second part is getting into what we can do to address those problems. And that part, I wouldn't call excellent. There are some things I liked about it and some things that just weren't to my taste. But we'll get into that. So first we'll talk about this first part, the runaway train. And the whole idea behind this concept is that for the past 100, 200 years, our economies have operated on the idea of economic growth and the unlimited potential for economic growth. That economic growth is always to be seen as a positive. The problem with that idea is that economic growth has a limit. At some point there has to be a limit, whether it be resources or capital, or I forget the other part. Anyway, he talked about this. And having a ecological background and understanding the way ecological systems work, to me it just feels natural that unlimited economic growth doesn't really make sense. So if you think about growth charts that you tend to see represented in our current economic system, you'll always be looking for this sort of upward trend. Whereas if you look at the way that life has functioned on this earth for the past, at least a couple billion years, it always works in a cycle. So you have, this group of organisms that will grow. The predators will then grow, which will then grow what predates on them. But then as they're predated, then these will go down and these cycles just go round and round. And it keeps a fairly steady sort of ecology. We won't go too extensively into ecologic theory. It goes not quite that simple, but for the purposes of this, that's a simple way to think about it. And so with that idea, the idea of perpetual economic growth is always going to be problematic. And the advantage that we had prior to the current time was that our population relative to the size of the earth was such that we could basically grow, and there was always new areas to grow into. But our population has exploded over the past 100 years because of improvements in nutrition and that sort of thing, which are very positive, but we also need to understand that if we have more people surviving the next generation, then we likely are going to be overpopulated in some number of generations. And this is what's causing, problems like climate change, is this idea of economic growth. And that's the goal of our economic systems and societies. Whereas what we need to have is an idea of a sustainable economy that works in this circular fashion, where whatever is considered waste is cycled back in and used to produce new items, and that there is just a circularity to it. And that is what he calls ecological economics, or steady state economics. But his discussion of the issues is very compelling. He gives a lot of great examples. He delves much more than I have, obviously, here into those different topics and the politics behind it as well. That in, for example, in the United States, in a bipartisan system or a two-party system, both parties are the parties of economic growth because it's been politically expedient. What was interesting was that he did note that in surveys done, about 75% of people said that economic growth was important to them. But I think it's 85 or 90% who care about leaving an earth that would be appropriate for grandchildren and future generations. And so that, I think, is quite hopeful, and that we should be focusing more on that, because we are doing so many things that will likely impact the earth for future generations. And so I think we do really need to address that up front and center and create a society that can exist through time. So in this first part, we have economic growth as a national goal. What did Jack Kemp really say, which was about economic growth? What will they think of next, and why? That's an interesting chapter, talking about how as resources, as we begin to see that there is a limit on resources, then economists have been able to use, they say, economic growth will be possible through the growth of the services sector, and so on. As Simon said, I'm perhaps not the audience for this particular chapter, where he talks about Julian Simon, who was apparently an economic theorist. I've never heard of him. And so he spent a lot of time delving into and discrediting his theories. But I was kind of already on board, so I didn't really need that. And then Copernicus, Are You Out There? Talks about Copernicus having his viewpoint of the solar system, which was ahead of its time, and he kind of sees current steady staters, or people looking for that circular economy, as the Copernicans of our time. But all of that is just to basically give you arguments and an understanding of why economic growth is not necessarily a good thing in our modern time, and why previously it's been a successful method for us, but now it's causing more and more problems into the present. So I really loved this first part. I thought it was great. When we get into the second part, this is getting into his suggestions about how we can address this issue. And he comes up with a lot of terms, and I honestly was not a big fan of most of his terms. So he thought that we could change the wealthy or upper class and call them the liquidating class. Being somebody who is obviously trying to market myself, being, a channel on YouTube and that sort of thing, I guess I'm more keenly aware of what sort of terms that I think are easily repeatable and just have that stickiness and attractiveness to them. So you can see this, as I was talking about, this sustainable economy, ecological economics idea that he was talking about. He wants to call it the steady state revolution. And I just don't think it's a very attractive name. I don't have an issue with most of his actual concepts. A lot of the concepts I think are quite good. One of his concepts gets into dating and females' role in creating the demand for men who are steady staters, which is a little heteronormative, I guess, not acknowledging all the sorts of different sort of relationships and the different ways that those function. And while I do think that there is pressure that can be put on, I think it's a big ask to put. I didn't really like those discussions. I didn't think that they spoke with nuance about those relationships, and I thought it was rather simplistic the way he spoke about that. One of my favorite terms he's come up with, though, as I said, the liquidating class, the steady state class, the amorphic class. These are all terms. The concepts I still think are good, and I think they should be applied, but I think if we want to achieve a steady state revolution, as he calls it, we're going to need to call it something else. I think it has to sound more attractive than that, because economic growth just has a natural, nice sound to it. Steady state doesn't. Even natural economics or something like that would be better. But anyway, one of the terms that I love, so he suggests that instead of using the term economic growth, that people who basically buy into this philosophy, that whenever somebody would otherwise use the term economic growth, that you use the term economic bloat. And I love this term, and it's applicable in so many places, because you think about if you are growing. I actually think about my little pet possum, and he was growing, and we would feed him, and growing was great to a certain extent, and then at some point he just started to put on way too much weight. He was becoming bloated. He actually got liver disease and almost died because basically the husbandry guides don't really give good advice on how to raise adult possums. Anyway, we've got an expert now, so we've been able to get him on a steady state diet. Again, I don't like that term, but best for what we have right now. But he was becoming bloated. It was past the point of growth being useful and to the point where it was detrimental to his health. And we are getting to the point where economic growth, further growth, is almost cancerous to our world. It is cancerous to our societies, and even potentially, my own personal thought is that it could be to the survival of our species in the long term. Just because of the huge ramifications there are for our ecosystems if all of the organisms who are endangered do go extinct and we lose all of that diversity. Just could have huge ramifications for how well our ecosystems function. And of course we need ecosystems in order to live our lives. We are part of ecosystems. And so I think economic bloat is a great term to counterbalance that, and it's a very unattractive but catchy way of saying it. And over here in Australia, one of the platforms of one of the major parties was jobs and growth. And so now I like to say jobs and bloat. And I think you really can, because it sounds so similar to growth. I love the term. So I think it works quite well. But as I said, I think for the liquidating class, which is people who are spending way more than any human needs to spend, I think probably a better term, because rich and wealthy, first of all, are 1 and 2 syllables. Once we get to 3 syllables, I just think it's too much. So I think the terms you need a bit more work, but I think the ideas are good. So I do definitely recommend this book. It's not very long. It took me a little while to read because I was reading it just basically a chapter at a time, but only 182 pages. And very, very relevant. It was written back in 2000, and it's really interesting to see, the global financial crisis which came after and that sort of thing. Not surprising, basically, with that perpetual growth idea. And I must say, 20 years on, I think we are still having so many problems, although we do have more discussion of sustainability. I do think that's a positive, but we definitely have more to go. So, definitely recommend that. That is shoveling fuel into for a runaway train. The runaway train obviously being our economy with too much economic growth. Next time, we'll be looking at one of my favorite books that I've read this year, Atomic Habits. Look forward to seeing